Testing, testing. Text message. Text message. Daniel Diaz-Delia. I'm not sure if you're going to be logged in today to Corpus Christi, but in case you are, I just sent you the PowerPoint presentation for the Millennial Temple Part 2 in English, so you can follow along. Thanks. We will be starting in about 1 minute. only imagine. Are we ready to go, Raymond? Raymond, are we ready to go? Can someone please close the back door? And we're going to lower the lights in a minute, but not quite yet. Thank you very much. That's good right there. Well, welcome to Sabbath services. I also want to welcome all of those of you that may be online listening in. We are going to be having a PowerPoint presentation. But before we do, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to bow your heads, and I'm going to open the meeting with prayer, please. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you very, very much for all the many blessings you give us. We are in awe of how well you take care of us, and extremely thankful to you for all the many blessings you give us. Thank you very much for the technical aspects of today's presentation. We pray that all goes well. Thank you very much for the men that have been working very diligently to make sure that this can happen. Thank you very much for allowing us to be here and to be keeping the Sabbath. Please watch over those that are not here, that are traveling, and bring them back safely next week and allow them to travel safely as they're traveling. Thank you very much for everything. Please bless the hearing as well as the speaking. We ask that you put your presence here in Christ's name. Amen. All right, we are going to be having a PowerPoint presentation, but before we do, I do have a couple of announcements. Like I say, I want to welcome all of you that are online. I know that we usually have several that are online. I think part of my family is online, so welcome to all of them. Did have a nice drive down. I've been driving for the last 4 Sabbaths. I've been somewhere. Well, actually, the last 6 out of 7 Sabbaths, I've been somewhere. And today was no exception. I went down to Harlingen, had a nice meeting with Harlingen. We had a Bible study down there, and also had a brown bag social. And, we had a covered dish social. And we had some chicken. We had some chicken with gravy over rice. We had some baked chicken, barbecue chicken, brisket, and a big homemade apple pie. And I do not exaggerate. It was about this big, probably 18 inches across, homemade. Also had some salad and all the trimmings that go with it. So we had a nice time in Harlingen. Once again, they told me to tell you that they wish they could be with you more often and to send you their greetings. I want to bring you up to date on a trip we had last week to Acuña, Mexico. My wife and I and Mark and Amalia Monsivais left on Friday about noon, and we got back Sunday around 4 o'clock. They got back about 4. We got back around 4:30 or 5 after we dropped them off. It was a 3-day trip, had no problems getting into Mexico, getting out, had no problems with anything. Everything worked out very nicely. Once again, thank you very much for your prayers. Whenever I pray for all of you, and I mention you all by name. Takes a long time. And I know that y'all do the same for me and my wife and the other ministers that are traveling. So if you were praying for us, your prayers were answered. We didn't have any kind of problems at all. We had a sermonette by Mr. Joe Elizondo. He's a member from San Antonio and has family that lives in Acuña and from that area around there. And he's, I think he originally was from Mexico, but I think he may have been born in the United States. He's giving sermonettes there in Acuña and also in San Antonio with Mr. Moody, of which he is a member. And then we had the song leading by Daniel Diaz, and they've been alternating back and forth. Mr. Monsivais goes with one in his hip pocket just in case. And so all that was done in Spanish. I had a sermon in Spanish. I gave you a sermon a couple of weeks before the feast. This is about 6 weeks ago, where we covered part 1 of the Millennial Temple. I gave them that as my sermon, and then we had a nice meal, chicken, all the trimmings. Mark made some, Mark and Amaya. Mark harvested a deer, and Mrs. Monsivais, Amaya, made up some carne guisada with venison meat. It was very delicious. We had that and various other things, fed us very well. And then on the second message, which was a Bible study after the meal, I presented them the Millennial Temple point here today, and I translated all my slides into Spanish and presented it in Spanish. So all of those activities went over very well, and I just want to thank you for everything. We do have a camp out announcement. This is a save the date. The camp out next year is March the 21st, which is Friday, the 22nd, which is Saturday, and the 23rd, which is Sunday. And I'm going to ask my wife if she'll pass one of these out to everyone, please. This is the brochure, updated brochure for this year. And I'm going to let her pass that out before we talk about it. No grandchildren here today, so grandmother has to fill in. And forgive me, I didn't get the best picture of you in the brochure. Those are just the ones I had handy. And this is going to be on March the 21st through the 23rd. I've already reserved the cabins, and I've already reserved the campsites. And just to go over a couple of things, it's $5 entry fee. If you have a park pass, they will take that in place of the fee. And I have about 10 cabins reserved and about 8 or 9 full hookup reserved there in Lake Corpus Christi on the Avelina Loop and the Cabin Loop. And I'm getting ready to send this out to the pastors in Texas, Mr. Moody, Mr. Burnett, Mr. Geezy, the Trey-Big pastors, and also Mr. Ellison, the pastor of Houston North and Houston South and Victoria now. So I'll be sending them this next week. I wanted to give you a heads up so you could have first choice. Once again, please don't tell me, I'd like to go camping and assume that you're going to get a site. You need to email me and let me know that you want to go camping and whether you want a cabin or whether you want a campsite. The cabins are $50 a night, so it'll be $100. The campsites are $25 a night, so it'll be $50. The cabins, as you know, air conditioning, a heater, a couple of tables, fire pit outside, and all the accoutrements, water, and a restroom nearby. So between now and next Friday, I'm not going to do anything with this information. If you want to go, then let me know. Please send me an email. If you think you might want to go and you're not sure, send me an email anyway and tell me to reserve one for you, because I can always back you out at the last minute. You got till like the second day before to get a refund, so it's not a problem. There's also some hotels nearby. Some of you have a concept that camping is a hotel room with a view of the forest. So I can get you some information about hotel rooms. But we are planning to have our camp out, and it has already been set. We're going to be having our Bible study there again in the old pavilion as we did last time. And the holy days fall in April. This is about 3 weeks before the holy days begin. So just let me know if you want to go to the camp out. We are going to be having a brown bag social here today. Whether you brought food or not, just stay. There's usually some left over. We can fellowship, and if you want, you can go pick up something and bring it back, or if you brought something right after Bible study's over, we'll be having our brown bag. This is going to be a Bible study, no songs, no sermonette, no announcements other than these. So I figure we'll be finished by about 4:15, and you'll actually get out of here a little bit earlier than normal. But we'll have a nice hour Bible study, and we'll have the brown bag social after that. So those are the things I needed to bring to your attention. Is there anything else, my dear, or anybody else that we left out or need to discuss? I think I've got everything. It's been a hectic last 2 months, but beginning to see a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. So we're going to go ahead with that, get into the Bible study today. Today, the Bible study is on the Millennial Temple, Part 2. If you remember, before the feast, and it just happened that it's been a long time since I gave you Part 1 because of the feast intervening and various other scheduling conflicts, that I'm now just getting to the Millennial Temple Part 2. And this is going to be a PowerPoint presentation. In the first Bible study, we discussed the need for a temple, if there was going to actually be one in the millennium. We also discussed the concept of sacrifices occurring in the temple. And then we talked about Christ's relationship to the temple. And that was a standard oral sermon. What I'm going to do today, because of the details that are given in the book of Ezekiel and there's lots of specifications and descriptions, I'm going to give you a PowerPoint presentation that has more graphics in it. I have not posted part 1 yet on the internet. I have not posted part 2, obviously. I've already given this in the Valley and in Acuna, but I want to give it here before I post it. So probably sometime tomorrow, in the next couple of days, I'll be posting part 1 and part 2, and the PowerPoints and the handouts that go with it, so that you can have all that information. I do have some handouts I'm going to have my wife give you out in a few minutes. Don't let me forget to do that, my dear. But I do have some handouts that I'll be giving you. But this is going to be a PowerPoint presentation, the second part of the Millennial Temple series, and I think you'll find it extremely interesting. Now, the Millennial Temple is mentioned all throughout the book of Ezekiel, especially in Ezekiel chapter 40 to about chapter 47, and it discusses it there in great detail. Now, the temple is very important. So notice I put temples in parentheses, and it's because we're not sure how many there are going to be, and I'll explain that in a minute. The importance of the temple, it helps us to understand the heavenly details and what's going on up in heaven, since the temple and the tabernacle are modeled after the things that occur up in heaven. The spiritual temple and the spiritual throne room of God and the spiritual throne room seat, Ark of the Covenant, and all those type of concepts are covered in great detail when we look at the heavenly sphere. So the temples help us to understand those things. It also helps us to understand the temples, helps us to understand the layout and details about Solomon's temple, about Herod's temple, and about the Ezekiel Millennial temple. So studying about the temples will help us to understand all about those 3 temples and possibly a 4th one. The temple, delving into the temple and the information of the Bible helps us to understand the story flow in many Old Testament observances. For example, in Leviticus 16, which occurs on the 10th day of the 7th month, which is atonement, it talks about yes, please, if you can dim the lights. It talks about the importance of the layout of the temple. Is that dark? And a little bit lighter, Mark. Is that okay for you to write on? Okay, can you see the screen all right? All right. So it helps us to understand the story flow of many Old Testament observances. Leviticus 16, the priest taking this blood into the Ark of the Covenant, the coming out, the doorway, the fit man, the washing with the laver and all that. If you understand how the temple's laid out, you'll understand the graphics of what's taking place with that ritual. It also helps us understand the setting of the book of Revelation, because if you look at Revelation and study it from a temple perspective, you'll learn a lot about what's in the book of Revelation. There's a chapter that's devoted exclusively to what goes on in the throne room of God. If you understand that the throne room of God is in the Holy of Holies, it helps you understand the story flow of Revelation. It also understands how man can have direct access to God. You remember when Jesus Christ died, the temple veil was rent in 2 from top to bottom, signifying that we now have direct access to God, and we no longer need a priest, a Levitical priest. And so if you understand about the temple and where the veil lays and what's involved in the furnishings, it'll help you understand how we can have direct access to God in a graphic way. It also helps us to understand God's plan of salvation. You enter by the doorway. First thing you do is you hit the altar, sacrifice of Christ. Second thing is you hit the laver, the washing, baptism. Then you go into the the holy place, where it has the bread, Jesus Christ being the bread, has the 7 tiered candelabra, which is, God and Jesus are the light of the temple. It also has the altar of incense being the prayers of the saints. And then you go into the Holy of Holies through the veil, which the priest did once a year on the Day of Atonement, and you have an understanding of the Ark of the Covenant, where the 10 Commandments and the pot of manna were, and 2 angels with their wings outspread. Don't remember it from the Bible. Think about Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Okay? Oh, yeah, I remember that. Okay, well, you've got the 2 angels with their wings outspread, and they covered the presence of God. That was God's throne room. The pillar of fire by day and the pillar of fire by night sat over the Ark of the Covenant, or God's mercy seat. It was called God's mercy seat because the priest went in there to beg for the mercy of the forgiveness of the sins for the people during that year. So if you understand about the temples, you'll understand a lot of these things and various many other things. Now let's discuss the temple. And the tabernacle. There was a tabernacle, and there's possibly 3 temples that have existed, possibly 4. We're going to look at that in a minute. They're indicated in the scriptures. The first was a tabernacle built by Moses. Then we have Solomon's temple, destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. Then we have 70 years later, the temple of Zerubbabel being built, also called the Ezra and Nehemiah temple. That was the second temple. Solomon's was the first. Then we have the third temple, the second temple, which was remodeled by Herod. And I'm not going to go back there, but last time we met, I gave you a handout about the different kinds of temples. So we have the second temple, Zerubbabel's, remodeled by Herod. This was a temple that Jesus Christ went into. Now, it was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70 by Titus, one of the generals, and he squashed the rebellion by the Jewish people. Very interesting time. And then there are some people that believe, because they read Daniel chapter 9 and the 70 weeks prophecy, they read the prophecies about that there's going to be another abomination of desolation, that there's going to be another altar that's going to be defiled. And they say, we have to have another temple right before the return of Jesus Christ. So this is the third temple. Some people say that, no, there's not going to be a third temple. There's only going to be an altar. And the altar is all that we need. So there's only going to be 3 temples, the third one being Ezekiel's temple. So depending on your concept of the prophetic end of times, we may have 3 temples or we may have 4. We may have 3 temples and an altar, or we may have 4 literal temples. And so understanding the temples it will help you understand what's indicated in the scriptures. The tabernacle, Feast of Tabernacles. Tabernacles means sukkah, a tent, or temporary. We have a tabernacle tent where they had the revival meeting. Tabernacle means temporary. So a tabernacle was a portable or temporary structure that could be easily moved. Children of Israel wandered in the wilderness. The spies brought back a bad report. So you're going to wander 40 years for every day you were gone and all of that. So here we have a tabernacle that was portable and could be easily moved. And we understand by looking at the temples that God desires to live among his people. And we're going to see that as we close out this Bible study. He wanted a relationship with them. He wanted a relationship with ancient Israel. They went idolatrous on him. He therefore raised up the church and is working with the church now. So we have the tabernacle and 3, possibly 4 temples. And we're going to discuss those as we lead into the Ezekiel temple. Now here's a picture of the tabernacle. I want you to notice some features of the tabernacle. We've got here the altar. Then we've got here the laver. You've got the fence. You've got the doorway, which was colored differently. You remember Christ said, I am the door. You can't get into this area here unless you go through the door, and the door is Christ. He talked about the sheep hear my voice, and I stand at the door, and I protect those that come in and out. So we got the door, the altar, the laver. Then right here you've got the holy place. It's a cutaway. You've got a tabernacle or a tent over it. And then here you've got the veil. And then here you've got the Holy of Holies, or as some translations say, the most holy place. And inside the holy place, you had the candle and the showbread and the altar of incense. You remember when Zechariah was in the temple, he was offering incense, and he delayed his coming out, and the angel Gabriel appeared to him and said, you're going to have John the Baptist. He was offering up right here in the altar of incense before the doorway or the veilway that goes into the Holy of Holies. Over here we have the Ark of the Covenant right up here with the 2 angels' wings outspread. Now I'm very familiar with the tabernacle and with the temple. As you all know, I've built several models of Noah's Ark. I also built a 4 by 8 foot model of the tabernacle in the wilderness. My wife did the sewing, and we did it so we could take it apart and present it as Bible studies to the various churches. I also made a model of Solomon's temple with a cutaway roof, and you could see inside of it with the courtyard and all of that. So I'm very familiar with the temple and with the tabernacle. I donated those first models of the tabernacle and the temple and my first models of Noah's Ark to Ambassador College, and they were on display there in the Ambassador College library. When the church went defunct, those disappeared. I don't know what happened to them. but I'm very familiar with the structures I'm talking about because I've actually built models of them that were displayed in the various churches. Now, the tabernacle is right here. This was built by Moses. You got the doorway right here. You got the courtyard fence there. You have the altar there. Notice the poles by the altar, so everything, you could put the poles through the rings and you could transport it. You've also got the laver there, which was a big water basin. In Solomon's temple, it had 12 golden oxen around it, and it was a very impressive structure. And then here you have the tent. So I want you to notice the components of the tabernacle, because they're going to pop up again when we look at the temples. We got the altar, we got the laver, and we got the tent with the holy place and the Holy of Holies in there. All right? Now, the tabernacle tent consisted of 2 rooms. The holy place and the Holy of Holies are sometimes the holy place and the most holy of holies. Just different, it's an extra special holy place is what they're getting at. Here is the way it's laid out. Now, this is reversed, and from the picture, the entrance is over here. Here's the veil. Here's the seven stemmed candelabra. Here's the table of showbread where the showbread was placed every day. And then here is the altar of incense right before the veil. This is what was rent in 2. Holy of Holies, Ark of the Covenant. The priests entered that once a year on the Day of Atonement. And so this gives you a schematic idea of what the temple looked like and how it was laid out. This is the tabernacle, and the temple and the temples that are coming are patterned after this. The temple of Ezekiel has some noticeable differences, which we'll discuss when we get there. The temples follow the layout of the tabernacle. The tabernacle, the temples, had a holy place, and the tabernacle and the temple had a most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. Now, here is a picture of Solomon's temple. This is the first temple, because it's the first temple that existed. It was patterned after the tabernacle. You'll see that by right here we have the altar. Right here we have the laver. Right here we have the tables of showbread and the candelabras, because there was more than one in Solomon's temple. Here we have the veil right here, and inside here we have the Holy of Holies. So it follows the same general pattern as the tabernacle. And the reason it follows the same general pattern as the tabernacle was because the tabernacle was modeled after what was up in heaven, and the heavens haven't changed. All right? So there is a throne room and an Ark of the Covenant in the heavens, and we'll discuss that in a little while. Here is Zerubbabel's temple. This was a second temple, called sometimes Ezra and Nehemiah's temple, called Zerubbabel's temple, because it was dedicated during the time that Zerubbabel was governor of Judea. So it goes by 3 different names. It is the second temple. The second temple. The first temple was Solomon's temple. This was built 70 years after. All right, let me rephrase that. The construction of it was started 70 years after the Solomon's temple was built. Nebuchadnezzar came into Judea, Jerusalem. He conquered the people. He sent them off captive. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel. They're in captivity. Daniel's praying, how long are we going to be in captivity? 70 years. A contingent comes out during the time of Cyrus, all right, and Artaxerxes, and they're given permission, Ezra and Nehemiah, to build a temple. This is a temple that they constructed right here. And it stood until the Romans destroyed it in 70 A.D. It was, however, remodeled by Herod. And this is the temple here and all the accoutrements that were added. And it was a very massive temple. Herod, and I exaggerate none at all, spared no expense to rebuild it. And it was a magnificent structure. This is the temple that Jesus came into. He was in the courtyards out here. He could not go into this area in here, but he was in the courtyard out here where any common person could go. So when he says he was in the temple teaching, he wasn't in here because he was of the house of Judah, a tribe of Judah. Was he a Levite? No, so he could not go in here. So when he's teaching in the temple and all of that kind of things that are going on, the woman taken in adultery, thrown at his feet inside the temple, that's all occurring right in this area right there. So once again, knowing about where the temple is and how it's structured helps you understand some of the events that took place in the Gospels and the Old Testament. Now, this temple was remodeled. Zerubbabel's temple was remodeled. Herod remodeled it. The Romans came and destroyed it in 70 A.D. Jesus Christ in the Olivet prophecy said, "Not one stone upon another will remain." So all of the stones were removed. The people that were taken captive in 70 A.D. were moved, many of them to Rome, where they were put to work building the Colosseum. My wife and I just got back from Italy, and we saw the Colosseum. Those were built by Jewish slaves that were enslaved when Herod's temple was destroyed, because the Colosseum was built around 72, 73 A.D. The monies that they used to build it were from the temple. We saw the Ark of Titus, and in the Ark of Titus, engraved in the Ark, is the Roman soldiers carrying away the candelabra. You've seen pictures of those. I actually saw the real engraving. It was very, very interesting to see that firsthand. Now, this temple was destroyed. There is no temple now. The Jews are waiting for a temple to be built. Some say that there's going to be another temple built that is going to be desecrated by the end time beast. And they say that there has to be a temple. Others say, no, there's not going to be a temple, because a temple mount and where the temple sits, or would sit, is where the Dome of the Rock is now. So we have a very important, prestigious religious icon, which is the Dome of the Rock for the Muslims, and they're not going to let that be destroyed to put up a Jewish structure. Others say that the location is incorrect, that it's in another area. That's another story. Others say we don't need to build a temple to have sacrifices. All we need to build is an altar. Noah offered sacrifices after the flood. He did it on an altar. Ezra and Nehemiah offered sacrifices before they built a temple. It was built before this altar was built before there was a temple. So you don't technically need a temple to sacrifice. Some people say all you're going to need is a sacrificial altar. So depending on whether a temple is built or not, you may have two temples and a sacrificial altar, and then the Ezekiel temple, or you may have the two temples, Herod's being the second, and then a new one being built, however that occurs, and then we have the Ezekiel temple. So there's either 3 temples or 4 temples, depending on your interpretation of prophecy. Now, I am going to give you some information on the coming Millennial Temple, my sources of information. One of them is www.freebibleimages.org. You can go there and download Bible images, and they're all royalty-free. They're all in the public domain. So all of my pictures come from that source or a few other sources. I also have access to Leroy Neff's. He was a church evangelist. You know Larry Neff. He was the former retired pastor of in Colorado. His father, Leroy Neff, which I heard preach many times because he was a pastor of San Antonio. When my wife and I came into the church in the early 70s, he would preach, and he would come to Corpus Christi to preach on the holy days. And I heard him preach, and I met him. He wrote a master's thesis on the Millennial Temple. So lots of information I've gotten out of his papers, which is freely available online. Just go to God's Temple and Prophecy, Leroy Neff, and punch it in, and it'll bring you to several sites that have his material archived. So some of the material comes from his publication. The other comes from a book called The Messiah's Coming Temple. It's an excellent book. I forgot to bring it. I have a copy of it, but it's an excellent book on the temple. Other than him believing in the rapture, he's a great person that believes in the rapture. I could not find anything wrong with his material doctrinally. He talks about the millennial temple. He talks about the millennium. He talks about the fact that there's going to be spirit beings and physical beings. He talks about the 1,000-year time period. He talks about the new heavens and the new earth. And he talks about sacrifices in the temple. Excellent source. If you're going to get one source of material, get this book here. Tear out the chapter on the rapture, and you're probably doing well. Okay? So that's where my information came from. Now, here's a picture of the Millennial Temple from Free Bible Images. And you've got the courtyard here. You've got the gates here. You've got the inner gates here. You've got the outer courtyard here. You've got the inner courtyard here. You've got the altar. You've got the temple complex right there, and various structures along the perimeter. And then you have the water, the spring coming out from underneath the threshold of the temple. This is a picture that's published by this organization, and it's free for you to download and to use with no restrictions. Very few, let me rephrase that. Now here is Larry Neff's temple, and here is the floor plan. Now this was built back in the 60s before they had 3D renderings and all that. but you'll see that the layout is exactly the same. They had the same source. You've got the outer gates, northern, eastern, southern. You've got the inner gates, northern, eastern, southern. You've got the outer courtyard. You've got the inner courtyard, and you've got the temple complex, some buildings over here, and you've got some structures over here, and various chambers along the edge right over here. So that's Larry Neff's floor plan. Here it is in the schematic, and what I've done is I've taken Larry Neff's floor plan, and here it is placed next to the floor plan by Free Bible Images, and you'll see that it's exactly the same. Got a gate here, gate over here, gate over here. Southern gate, southern gate. Temple complex, buildings over here in threes, buildings over here in threes. Inner courtyard, altar out here, and you've got the 30 chambers out here, and you've got the chamber at each corner, as he has here. So since it's exactly the same, I've gone ahead and used the Free Bible Images as my default for this presentation. All right? So here it is laid out again. So now we're going to discuss some of the things that have to do with this specifications for the temple. Now let's look at a couple of things. Yards, inches, cubits, how is it measured? We can measure the temple complex and its structures to within a couple of inches because we have some standards of rule that are given to us for measuring. It's and right here I've got some scriptures. Notice I don't say what book it is because all of these scriptures come out of Ezekiel. So this is Ezekiel 40, verse 5. So let's go to chapter 40 of the book of Ezekiel, and unless it's a different book, I'm not going to mention the chapter or the title. So we're going to go to Ezekiel chapter 40, and we're going to look at what it says in chapter 40. Are y'all a little warm? Can you adjust the air conditioner, Mark? So Ezekiel chapter 40, verse 5. Now there was a wall all around the outside of the temple. In the man's hand now this was an angel, was a measuring rod, 6 cubits long, each being a cubit and a handbreadth. And he measured the width of the wall, 1 rod around the height, 1 rod. So what we have is we have a rod that he uses to measure. We have a cubit. The standard cubit was 18 inches, which was from here to here. Now how they did it, because everybody's different, is they got 40 or 50 people, and they measured their distance from here, and they took an average. If you take 40, 50 people, it's going to average out to very close to 18 inches. Now, notice what it says, a cubit and a handbreadth. So it was 18 inches plus a handbreadth. So you add a handbreadth to that. So 18 inches and about another 3 inches, and that brings you to what is called the royal cubit. Sometimes it's called the temple cubit. So the standard cubit is 18 inches. The royal cubit, which is a cubit they're using in the book of Ezekiel, is 21 inches. So remember that we're looking at dealing with a 21-inch cubit. Now, a rod was 6 cubits long. So if a cubit is 21 inches, and we have 6 of them, 6 times 21 is 126 inches, or 10 1/2 feet. So the wall was 1 cubit, 1 rod high. It was 10 1/2 feet high, and it was 10 1/2 feet across. So this gives you an idea of what kind of measuring instrument is being used when we describe the different specifications for the Millennial Temple. And the Millennial Temple, I'm not going to cover everything. I don't have time. It gives you the distance that the doorways were, how thick the walls were, how high certain sections of it. I'm just giving you the basics. Now, before I get into that, I'm going to ask my lovely wife once again to pass out this handout. And this handout is going to cover in schematic form all the things we're going to be talking about today. And I'm going to go ahead and drink some water while she passes that out. And I'm going to post this online when I post the Bible study. And if you look at the book of Ezekiel, there's a little tour that takes place. He goes in one place, goes to another place, and you can go and draw a picture of the temple and follow along and draw a line to where he goes. Now, I'm gonna let you look at this. I want you to notice that it has certain features to it. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to let you look at it for a minute, and then I'm going to ask you to put it away. But you can keep this later for your own personal study and follow along on the PowerPoint later on if you want to when we have this posted online. So you would be as kind as to put that away. We are going to discuss in specific those things that are there. Now, so we have the royal cubit. We have the rod, which is 6 royal cubits. We have a rod, which is 10.5 feet long. So we have 2 standards of measure. We have a rod, 10.5 feet long. We have a cubit, which is a royal, 21 inches. So remember that when it talks about specific distances. The Millennial Temple is surrounded by a wall. The wall surrounds the temple. There's the wall right there. All right. The Millennial Temple had eastern gates, an outer court, and 30 chambers. It had an eastern gate, an outer wall, and 30 chambers, 10 over here, 10 over here, 10 over here. You remember last time we talked about sacrifices? Those chambers are very important when we look at the sacrifices. Let's look at chapter 40, verse 6, down a verse. Then he went to the gateway which faced east, and he went up the stairs and measured the threshold of the gateway, and it gives you the width of the gateway. So what's happening is here in chapter 40, verse 6, he's describing this eastern gateway here and coming up the steps. All right? And so there's the eastern gate. And we have an outer court, verse 17, first part. Then he brought me into the inner court, and there was a chamber and a pavement made of all around the court. So here's the outer court right here, and there's an inner court right here, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So here's the outer court. Let's look at the second part of 40. Second part of 40:17. Notice 17, it says, and there were 30 chambers, and they face the pavement. So we've got 30 chambers here. 5 and 5 is 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. There's 30 chambers facing the perimeter of the courtyard. All right? And those chambers were very important. We'll talk about those later on. There's the chambers there. Now, we had a northern and a southern gate. Notice verse 20 and 23. On the outer court was also a gateway facing north, and he measured it, and he gives the measurements and specifics about this gate, how tall it was, how wide it was, how big the doorway was. In verse 33, and a gate of the inner court was opposite the northern gateway, just as the eastern gateway. So you got all of the gates are actually the same size. So if you know which one, if you know the measurement for one, this verse is telling you that all the other gates are the same way. So we got the northern gate here, and then we got the southern gate over here. All right? So if this is a northern gate and this is a southern gate, this is going to be the eastern gate. There is no western gate. Now you see this area right here. This area right here. I'm going to be enlarging it. There it is right there. All right? And so this is the gates and the inner court. This is the inner courtyard here, and this is a northern, eastern, and southern gates right here. These gates are exactly the same as the outer gates in dimension, because it says if you know one, you know the other, in more or less scriptural terms. Now, we have the southern inner gate. Go to 28:31, same chapter. Then he brought me into the inner court through the southern gateway. He measured the southern gateway according to the same measurements. So we've got the southern gateway here. Here's the southern gateway. So this is being described in 28 through 31. And I'm not going to read you the whole scriptures. Just get an idea of where they are. Here we have the inner courtyard. And there's the inner courtyard. This is the outer courtyard here. You go through this gate, and then you go into the inner courtyard. The inner courtyard is discussed in verse 32. And he brought me into the inner courtyard facing. So there's a description of the inner courtyard. All right. Then we have the northern inner gate, which is right there. That's described in 35 and 37. Then he brought me out to the northern gateway, and it gives you the measurements and all of that of the northern gateway. So here we have in this, from about 28 to about 37 and in chapter 40, we have described the southern inner gate the inner courtyard and the northern inner gate. And these gates here are described when we describe the eastern gate out here, and they were the same size. So we know that they were identical to the other gates. Now, this area right here, right over here, this area right over here, you can't see it, but there's some chambers there, and there's another chamber here. We're going to rotate this right here, and we're going to bring up this view right here. This is the eastern gate over here, all right? And this is the northern gate. This is southern gate. We've rotated it. Now, we're going to discuss those. There was chambers to wash the offerings. You remember I told you that there's lots of verses in Ezekiel and these chapters that talk about sacrifices and offerings and washings. Well, if you're going to have sacrifices, you need tables, you need places for the priest, you need places to store stuff, you need places to flay the sacrifices, you need places to store them. This is describing those things right there. Here's a chamber to wash the offerings. Notice verse 38. There was a chamber in its entrance to the gatepost of the gateway where they washed the burnt offerings. So not only do you have burnt offerings, but you have a place where you wash them. So right here is the place where the burnt offerings were washed. Right? Now, there's tables for the sacrifices. Those are in 39 through 43. Let's go to 39. In the vestibule of the gateway were 2 tables on this side and 2 tables on that side. So here's the 2 tables right here on one side of the threshold. Here's the 2 tables right here on the other side. There was 8 tables altogether. The others are not shown because they were inside the vestibule. So inside the entrance, we have another 4 tables that are right in here. So we got 8 tables, 4 not shown. So those are the tables where they process the offerings. I mean, if you're not going to have offerings, why do you have so much detail about what's going to take place with the offerings? They had chambers for the priests and the singers. You know, there were some Levites that were singers. There were some Levites that were in charge of butchering the animals. There were Levites in charge of the carpentries. There were Levites in charge of collecting water. There were Levites in charge of collecting firewood. All kinds of Levites. Not everyone was a high priest. Some were priests, but they were all priests. They were all from the tribe of Levi. And here we have the chamber for the priests and the singers. Notice verse 44 through 46. Outside the inner gate were the chambers for the singers. And verse 45, this is a chamber which faces south for the priests in charge of the temple. So you had here chambers for the priests and chambers for the singers, where they would prepare themselves and, have the material they needed to do whatever their job was. So here's a look of what the inner courtyard looked like and some of the structures that were inside. Notice right here we have the altar right here. We'll talk about the altar in a minute. This was the entrance to the temple. Over here we have the holy place, and not shown as the Holy of Holies. This was a temple proper. The temple sits in the inner courtyard. So here's a temple proper, and it sits in the inner courtyard. This is the outer courtyard. There's the inner courtyard, and there's a temple. All right? Now, we're going to take this part here, and we're going to enlarge it. Here is the temple. Here's the courts the gates we talked about. Here's the chambers for the priests that were singers and the priests that were in charge of the offerings. Back here, not shown, was another chamber where they did the washings. We got the temple proper here. We're going to enlarge that now. So we got the temple and the inner court. Here is the temple, right here. There's the altar. Here's the gateways. We have in verse 41, 1 through 2, next chapter. Then he brought me into the sanctuary and measured the doorpost. Tells you how the doorposts, how wide they were, the width of the entryway, etc., etc. And then in verse 3, inside and measured the doorpost 2 cubits, 6 cubits. Then he measured the length 20 cubits and the width 20 cubits of the structure. So it talks here, notice in verse 2, it's 40 and 20, and in verse 3, it's 20 and 20. And the 40 and 20 are describing the holy place, and the 20 by 20 is describing the most holy place. So the holy place was 40 by 20 by 20. The most holy place, or the Holy of Holies, was 20 by 20 by 20, perfect cube. So the most holy place, right in here, the veil would be right here if there existed one. The holy place, most holy place, had a perfect cube as its measurement. The holy place was double a perfect cube. And you can get a numerology and all that, but God lived in a perfect area. That's what it's basically trying to tell us. So here we have the holy place, and here we have the most holy place. So the most holy place is right here, and then we have the Holy of Holies right over here, or the holy place right here. Let me rephrase that. We have the holy place here, and the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies right over here. All right? And then we have behind it a separate building, or a building of separation. You know, you read separate building, you say, well, that's a building apart. It also could mean it's a building where things that were separate were kept. If you're dealing with a holy place and a holy of holies, then things are holy. If things are not holy and they're defiled, where do you put them? A lot of scholars believe that they were put in the building of separation. It's not a separate building, but a building of separation. So behind the temple proper was a separate building. That's in verse 12 of 41. The building that faces the separating courtyard at the western end was 70 cubits wide, and so forth and so on. So it tells you the dimensions of the separate building. Now, inside here, the holy place, was an altar of incense. Here's a picture of the altar of incense. It gives you the dimensions in verse 22. The altar was of wood, 3 cubits high. How tall is a cubit? How big is a cubit? 21 inches. 3 times 21 is 63. So therefore, we know the width. We know the width and the height of the altar of incense. It was about 5 feet high and about this wide. And notice that it has 4 horns on it. All of these things are described in detail. So this is the altar of incense. Now, this is a temple itself. Here's the altar, not of incense. The altar of incense is in here. Here's a altar of burnt offerings. Here's the gates here and over here. Here's the inner courtyard. Here's the temple proper itself. Now, there were dining rooms for the priests. When you offered an offering in the Old Testament to the Levites, part of the sacrifice was burned, and part of the sacrifice was given to the priests. So of every day, you were given 45 prime rib roasts. How well did you eat? And you could sell those. How did the priests make their living? Because they were in charge of it belonged to the priests. They could do whatever they wanted with them. Now, if the priests are going to eat the offerings, you got to have a dining room for them to eat the offerings. Notice the details here. So here's a dining room for the priest. Chapter 42, you can begin to read in verse 1. Mine has a heading on it, says a chamber for the priest. So right in here, we had the chamber for the priest, dining room for the priest, and there was 3 stories, gallery upon gallery. Notice the 3 floors here. So you had a gallery upon a gallery, and then you had another set of galleries over here, and you had the opposite of them right over here also. So these were places where the priests ate. Notice 3 through 6 of chapter 42. Opposite the inner court and 20 cubits, and opposite the pavement of the inner court was gallery against gallery in 3 stories. So it gives a description of the 3-storied galleries here upon galleries. So they were facing each other. And you got the same setup down over here. This was in 13A. Notice 13A. The north chambers and the southern chambers. So you had north chambers and you had south chambers. So this is where the priests ate the offerings. So if you were going to make an offering, the priests got to eat some of it. And if they got to eat some of it, you would have to have a place for them to eat it. And this is where they ate it. So this is called the dining halls or the dining rooms of the priests. There were some on the north, there were some on the south, and they were in 3 stories. Here is a picture here of the altar. We talked about the altar that sits before the temple complex. And you can read in 43, 13 through 17. Mine has the dimensions of the altar. It tells you how long this section was. It tells you how tall this section was. It tells you how tall this section was. It tells you how tall this section was. When you add all the sections together, you have 19 feet. You have an altar that's about 19 feet. And it gives other details. Like I say, I don't have time to talk to you about all that. This is the Millennial Temple and the temple kitchens. You're going to cook the offerings. You got to cook them somewhere. And so we have here temple kitchens, 4621. Go forward a few chapters to 4621. 4621. Then he brought me into the outer court and caused me to pass by the 4 corners of the court. And in fact, in every corner of the court, there was another court. And the 4 corners of the court were enclosed courts, 40 cubits, etc., row of buildings, and all around the 4 of them, and cooking hearths were made under the rows all around them. And he said, these are the kitchens where the ministers of the temple shall boil the sacrifices of the people. You remember boiling, and remember Zechariah. We're going to go to Zechariah in a minute. Remember that we have places here where the sacrifices are boiled. There's one there. There are one at each corner. One there, and I didn't show them here. But at each corner, there were chambers for those who boil. One at each corner. Now we're going to look at the temple complex itself. Now notice this right here, this area right here. This is this area right here. So now we're going to look at an outer dimension. There was a court or an area around here. It's described in 42, 15, and 20. Let's go to 42, 15, and 20. Now remember, when it talks about these dimensions, some of them are in rods and some of them are in cubits. 42, 15. It talks about how wide this is, and then it talks about how wide this is. And don't confuse the two. 42, 15. Now, when he had finished measuring the inner court, he brought me through the gateway that faces towards the east and measured it all around. He measured the east side with a measuring rod. How long is a rod? 10.5 feet. 500 rods. So if you've got 500 rods, and each rod is 10.5 feet, you've got 5,250 feet from here to here. A mile, I think, is 5,280 feet, something like that. So this is a couple of feet less than a mile. This was a big area. A lot of people tell you, oh, yeah, this is symbolic because there's no 1 mile flat area around Jerusalem right now where this can be built. You remember when Jesus Christ returns, we got Zechariah, and we have the Mount of Olives cleaving in 2, and we got a lot of earthquake activity. Some parts of it are going to be leveled. So there'll be places to put a mile-wide structure. Now, it also, in 20, verse 20, he measured at all the 4 sides, 500 cubits. So the 500 cubits is referring to this area right here. And so what we got is we got 500 cubits of 21 inches. That's 875 feet. But we know how wide the temple complex is, and we know how wide the courtyard was around the temple because it gives us the measurements here in these verses we're looking at. Millennial Temple and the differences between it and the Mosaic or the Zerubbabel or the Herod Temple. There's lots of differences, and they're very interesting. There is no veil between the holy place and the most holy place. In the Millennial Temple, in Ezekiel's temple, there's no veil. Why not? Because it was removed. There's no need. Do you and I have direct access to God? Temple veil, there's no need for the temple to have a veil. The oil lamp and the candelabra, I've read somewhere where Jesus and the Father are the light of the temple, so we don't need a candelabra in the temple. Table of showbread, Jesus Christ is the bread of life, right? He's going to be, as we learned last time, sitting in the temple, in the throne room. We don't need anything representing him because he's in it. The court of the women, have you not read? There's no slave, there's no free, there's no male, there's no female. when you're a spirit being and you get to enter the temple, there's no separation of men and women, because as far as the temple is concerned, that will not exist. There's no laver, because the laver represents baptism and cleaning. Spirit beings are going to be in this area here. So it's another subject. There's no separation of Gentiles, because the Gentiles are now included in the plan of salvation. So those are some of the differences between the millennial temple and the temple of Zerubbabel and of Herod. The Mosaic system and the millennial system. A lot of people say, well, the Mosaic system says this, and the millennial temple says this, and how can, they're different. They are different. The dimensions are different. There's different sacrifices. There's different holy days, and don't get bent out of shape with that statement, but there's different holy days being observed, and there's different things being done. And the reason is because the Ezekiel temple does not violate the Mosaic temple service, because it's not the same system. The Mosaic temple was patterned after the Levitical system. Jesus Christ is going to be ensconced in the throne room. Some scholars say that the prince of the temple is going to be the resurrected King David, who's going to be over all the house of Israel, all right? And that it's not going to violate the Mosaic temple, because it's not the Levitical system. Jesus Christ is a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So it's a different priestly system with different ordinances. Therefore, the temple is not the same. There were two separate temples. These two temples serve different purposes. Therefore, they do not have to be the same. There's going to be feasts kept in the millennial temple. 45:21. 45:21. 45:21. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, we've had dozens of Bible studies. When is the Passover? First day, first month, 14th day. So we're looking at the festival on the 14th day of the first month. What do we got? Well, you don't have to wonder. It tells you. On the first month, or the first moon, on the 14th day of the first month, you shall observe the Passover, a feast 7 days. Unleavened bread shall be eaten. So there's going to be a Passover and the days of unleavened bread associated with the temple. And on the day the prince shall prepare for himself and for all the people a bull for sin offering. And then it talks about the offerings for each day of the days of unleavened bread. So in the millennial temple, the Passover is going to be observed. The days of unleavened bread are going to be observed. There's going to be sacrifices on each of the days. Notice verse 25. In the 7th month, on the 15th day of the month. What day is that? First day of the Feast of Tabernacles. And you've got the days that are associated with the Feast of Tabernacles. Bingo. You're going to do the same thing on those days as you did on the days of the Passover, or the days of unleavened bread. So what we have here is we have the Passover being celebrated, and we have the Feast of Tabernacles being observed. Now, you remember I told you that there's going to be some differences in observations of the feast. Remember last time we talked about the sacrifices, and we talked about the sacrifices in Hebrews not being all the sacrifices, but being the sacrifices that were associated with atonement, because on the Day of Atonement, the priest went into the temple through the veil, and the veil has been torn in two. The sacrifices that were abrogated or done away with are no longer necessary, were the atonement sacrifices, because Jesus Christ is now accessible to us. Therefore, this temple here does not have a veil, and it does not have atonement services. Little speculation, but Ezekiel-y based. All right? Now, let's go to Zechariah chapter 14. And we read Zechariah 14, and we read about, oh yeah, Zechariah 14, it keeps the Feast of Tabernacles, and we're doing that before, and we're involved in something that's coming. And we read that, and it's all true, but there's some things that we leave out. Zechariah 14, this is the day of the Lord. In verse 2, there's armies. Verse 3, he's going to fight. His feet are going to stand on the Mount of Olives. Jesus Christ returns. The survivors of this great battle are going to come up year to year to do what? To keep the Feast of Tabernacles. In Zechariah, in Ezekiel, we just read about what's going to happen when they keep the Feast of Tabernacles. They're going to have offerings on the days of the feast. Now notice verse 19. This shall be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the Egyptians nations that do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacle. Now, notice what it says in verse 20 and verse 21. Now that you understand there's going to be a temple, now that you understand there's going to be places for washings, now that you understand there's going to be places for boiling, 20 and 21 make perfect sense. In that day, holiness to the Lord shall be engraved on the bells of the horses. The pots of the Lord's house shall be like the bowls before the altar. Yes, every pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be holiness to the Lord of hosts. Everyone who sacrifices shall come and take them and cook in them. In that day there shall be no more longer be a Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts. You got cooking, you got all of this stuff that's going on with holiness and pots, and we just looked at all of the chambers where this is going to be done. So it fits right in with Zechariah. Now let's consider a couple of other things that are allied to the temple. We got the Millennial Temple and the topography of the Dead Sea. This is, some of you, I think Mr. T has been to the Dead Sea. Were you able to float in the Dead Sea? Could you sink? Nope. And it's called the Dead Sea because nothing grows in it. It's so salty that hardly even any microbes grow in it. It's supposed to be good for your skin, sterilized and all that. Now here's a picture of the Dead Sea, and here's salt that's condensed or evaporated out of the salt in the Dead Sea. Here's another picture of the Dead Sea. These are salt flats, sheets of salt. You don't have to boil off the water to get the salt. You just go and break it up and put it in your bag. And here is the Dead Sea. Now, where's the Dead Sea located? You got the Dead Sea located between Jerusalem, and here's Jerusalem. Jerusalem is right there. You got the Dead Sea. It's located right there. And you got the Mediterranean Sea, and it's located right there. So you got Jerusalem, the Dead Sea, and Mediterranean Sea. Here in the Jerusalem is where the Millennial Temple is going to be. When Solomon's temple was built, it was built over a spring. Historical records indicate that there was a spring that it was built over, and that a spring actually flowed out of the temple. You remember Jesus Christ saying, I'm living waters, come to me and drink and all of that? There was a spring that came out from underneath the temple. When the children of Israel and the children of Judah went pagan, the spring dried up. Isn't that interesting? What does that mean? I'll let you put it together. You're a very astute congregation. Well, the Millennial Temple is going to have a spring flowing out from underneath the threshold of the temple, just like the original temple did. And this is a very interesting spring. Go to chapter 47. Chapter 47 of Ezekiel. Then he brought me, verse 1, back to the door of the temple, and there was water flowing from under the threshold of the temple towards the east. What is east of Jerusalem? I just showed you a map. That's the Dead Sea. Towards the east, for the front of the temple faced east. The water was flowing from under the right side of the temple, south of the altar. So here we have the right side of the temple, south of the altar. Right? He brought me out, verse 2, he brought me out of the way of the north gate and led me around on the south, outside to the outer gate that faces east, and there was water running out of the right side. And what happens, I'm not going to read it all to you, but what happens as this water starts flowing to the Dead Sea, it gets wider and wider. It starts off as a spring. It ends up as a creek. It becomes a river, knee deep and ankle deep. Then it becomes a great river that you could float in. And it's flowing towards the Dead Sea. And when it gets to the Dead Sea, it heals the Dead Sea because it provides an inlet of fresh water. And you can read about that in, I think, verse 8. Let's go to verse 8. Verse 7, when I returned there along the bank of the river were many trees on one side and on the other. Then he said, the water flows towards the eastern region, goes down into the valley, and enters the sea. When it reaches the sea, its waters are healed. So this water heals the sea, right? Now, as you keep going further on, there's the stream coming out of the temple. When you keep going on in verse 9 and 10, lots of fish. The river's so wide that you have fish going in there, and men are going to be fishing and harvesting the fish. I'm not going to read it all to you. You can read it yourself. And notice what it says in verse 12. Let's start with verse 11. But its swamps and its marshes will not be healed. So there's going to be some swamps on either side, and they will be given over to salt. Notice, along the bank of the river, on the side, on this side and that, will grow all kinds of trees used for food. Its leaves will not wither, and their fruit will not fail. They will bear fruit every month, because their waters flow from the sanctuary, and their fruit will be food, and their leaves for medicine. Now, if you read the margin where it says medicine, it says their leaves will be for healing. Now, have you ever read somewhere else about water coming out from underneath the temple, and you have the tree of life with 12 manners of fruit, and every month it yields fruit, and the fruit is for the healing of the nations? This is what Revelation is talking about, this idea right here. Let's go to Revelation 21. Now, the temple, God comes to the earth to live with his children. We do not go up to heaven to live with God. God comes down to live with man. Satan wants to get to heaven, brethren. When Satan gets to heaven, if he ever does, there's nobody going to be there, because Jesus Christ is coming down to the earth to live. How do we know that? Because we can read that in the scriptures. Notice what it says, and now some of these scriptures are going to make a little more sense. Revelation 21. Revelation 21. Last couple of chapters in the book of Revelation, and actually in your Bible. Revelation 21. And let's go ahead and read the first 7 verses. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no more sea. Then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, adorned for a husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle, temple, tabernacle, dwelling place of God is with men, and he will dwell with them. Where is this temple coming down to? It's coming down to the earth. And he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. When my father passed away, the Catholic priest said, we'd like you to read some scriptures. We have a time here where we read scriptures. What scripture would you like to read? I read him this scripture is right here. Verse 4, and God shall wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. And he sat me on the throne, and said, then he sat on the throne, and he said, Behold, I make all things new. And he said to me, Write, for these words are true and faithful. And he said, I am the A to the Z, the beginning to the end. I will give of the fountains of the water of life freely to him who thirsts. You know, you got this spring coming out from the temple, brethren, being fulfilled right here. Verse 7, he who floats downstream like a dead fish. No, I'm sorry. He who overcomes. My wife and I listened last night while we were in Harlingen. After the Sabbath arrived, we listened to Mr. Joel Meeker's Friday Night Live on the book of Revelation and the 7 churches and their lesson for us. And every church, God told them the same. He who overcomes. It's not an option, brethren. We have to overcome ourselves. He who overcomes. Notice what it says in verse 7. He who overcomes, the word there for overcome, as I mentioned before, is the word Nike. Same word used for the tennis shoes. Because if you use our shoes, you can overcome anything. He who Nikes, he who overcomes, shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. So God's temple is coming down like a city, New Jerusalem, and eternity has been prepared for us, brethren. That's what the temples point to, and the millennial temple points to that. Notice Revelation chapter 22, last chapter, first 3 verses. And he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding from the throne of God and of the Lamb. Do we see that ensconced here in the section in Ezekiel? Same thing being described in another place. In the middle of the street and on either side of the river was the tree of life, which bare 12 fruits, each tree yielding its fruit every month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Have we read about that in Ezekiel? We certainly have, brethren. Same exact thing. Same exact thing. And so what we have is we have in the Garden of Eden, the tree of life was there. You cannot eat of the tree of life. Why can't we eat of the tree of life, brethren? We cannot eat of the tree of life because it would be frustrating, and it would be a living hell for us to live eternally the way we are. Would you like to live the way you are for the rest of eternity? I mean, not me. I don't like myself. I want to change. You should too. So here it says that the tree of life was there. We had the tree of life at the beginning. We were denied access to it because we were not worthy to take of the tree of life. Here in the very last chapter, we have the tree of life being established again, and it proceeds from the things that come from the Ezekiel temple. How important is the Ezekiel temple? Very important. Verse 3, and there shall be no more curse, but the throne of God and of the Lamb shall be in it, and his servants shall serve him. And you know what this brings up? This brings up my final idea here. And this is something that we don't think about. And that is that the temples point to the fact that you and I are going to serve God for eternity. That's what they picture. This concludes the study. Let me give you a little bit of my photo credits here. Here's my photo credits. Here's my works cited. And if anyone has any questions or comments, I'll be able to take those now, or if anybody wants to say anything. Yes, ma'am. The temple looks like a tent. Yes. Yes, ma'am. There is a fence around the tabernacle to keep people out and animals, and there was a fence around the temple to keep people out. The temple is not accessible to everyone, brethren. There is a fence. There's nothing wrong with having fences. They divide things. And the temple had a fence for a specific purpose, and that was to keep people that shouldn't be in the temple out. There's something symbolic in that. Something symbolic in that. But it did have a fence. Yes, ma'am. Any other questions or comments? Yes, ma'am. The temples were all the same size. They all had the same dimensions. The tabernacle was a different size. In Exodus, God, remember when Moses goes up and he's gone for 40 days, and they wonder what's going on? Well, he was up there, and the people downstairs were having the orgy. I think that was the first time. But anyway, he goes up there for 40 days. God is giving him the instructions on how to build the tabernacle, and he gives him the dimensions. So the dimensions of the tabernacle were a certain size, but the dimensions for the temples were different, but the proportions were the same. The tabernacle had a perfect cube, and the temple had a perfect cube, and the dimensions were the same ratio. So they were different. A good question. The tabernacle and the temple had different dimensions, but the ratios were the same. All right, very good. I think I asked Mr. Monsiváis if he would come forward and close with prayer, and also ask a blessing on the food that we're about to eat. And by the way, those of you that are listening online, and those of you here, I will have this information posted probably in the next couple of days.
Bow your heads. Almighty Father in heaven, we thank you, God, above all, for this day, dear God, that you set aside, not only for rest, but to learn your ways, dear God, to educate us. We thank you for enlightening our minds on the future of your temple that you will provide for us, dear God. And we ask you, God, also to bless the meal that we're about to eat and help it nourish our bodies. We ask these things, Almighty Father, in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.